A woman kidnapped 18 years ago from South Lake Tahoe is back with her mother tonight. Jaycee Dugard was abducted in 1991. She was just 11 years old. Police say 58-year-old Phillip Garrido held her the entire time as a virtual slave in his backyard in Antioch. Garrido admitted to the kidnapping during a meeting with his parole officer yesterday. Investigators also say that Garrido fathered 2 children with Dugard.
You are standing at the corner of Pioneer Trail and Washoe Boulevard in South Lake Tahoe, California. It is 8:10 inches the morning on the 10th of June, 1991. The air is cool, the way mountain air always is, before the sun gets high enough to matter. There is a school bus stop at the end of the street, and a little girl is walking toward it in a pink jacket. She has blonde hair and blue eyes, and she is 11 years old. Her name is Jaycee Lee Dugard, and she is walking uphill to her stop the same way she has done it dozens of times before, on a quiet residential street in a small lakeside community where families move precisely because it feels safe. She never makes it to the bus. A 2-tone gray sedan pulls alongside her. A woman in the passenger seat activates a stun gun. Jaycee collapses. They pull her into the car. In the house at the bottom of the hill, her stepfather, Parole, is watching through the garage window. He sees all of it happen. He gets on his bicycle and he chases the car. He cannot catch it. By the time he reaches the end of the street, the sedan has turned and is gone, and his stepdaughter is in it, and she is gone too. He calls the police. California Highway Patrol sets up roadblocks at the exits from the Tahoe Basin within the hour. It doesn't matter. Phillip and Nancy Garrido are already through. What happened next is one of the most disturbing stories in American criminal history, not just because of what was done to Jaycee Lee Dugard, though what was done to her is almost beyond comprehension, but because of how long it lasted, because of how many times the system that was supposed to catch it looked directly at it and looked away, because a little girl in a pink jacket walked up a hill one morning and didn't come home for 18 years. And the man who took her was not a ghost. He was not invisible. He was a convicted sex offender on lifetime parole, monitored by the state of California, visited by agents 60 times over the course of those 18 years. His neighbors knew something was wrong. A child lived in his backyard, and nobody stopped it. This is the story of Jaycee Lee Dugard, and it begins the way the worst stories always do, with a man the system decided to trust. Jaycee was born on the 3rd of May, 1980, in Anaheim, California. By the time she was 11, her family had settled in South Lake Tahoe, a mountain resort community straddling the California-Nevada border, the kind of place where the streets are lined with pines and the lake is so blue it looks painted. She lived with her mother, Terry Probin, and her stepfather, Carl, and by every account she was a bright, sweet, ordinary child on the edge of growing up. She loved cats. She had friends she walked to the bus stop with in the mornings. She was, in the way that children are before the world teaches them otherwise, entirely trusting of the world around her. She had no reason not to be. On the morning she was taken, she had walked ahead of a neighbor's child, a few minutes early, moving uphill toward the corner. That small gap, a few minutes, 100 yards, was all it took. Carl Probin watched from the garage, too far away to intervene, close enough that the image never left him. He spent years under the weight of that window. Phillip Craig Garrido was 50 years old the day he was arrested in 2009. He had spent decades constructing 2 simultaneous lives. In one, he was an eccentric but seemingly harmless man in Antioch, California, a registered sex offender who ran a small printing business out of his property, who talked obsessively about God and sound and religious visions, who wore ankle monitoring equipment and met regularly with his parole agents. In the other, he was a man who had kidnapped an 11-year-old child, locked her in a backyard compound, her repeatedly for years, fathered 2 children by her, and kept all 3 of them hidden from the world, behind fencing and tarps and soundproofed walls, while the state of California checked in on him and drove away. To understand how this was possible, you have to go back further, all the way to 1972. Garrido's pattern of predation did not begin with Jaycee. According to a map of his known crimes compiled by the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office, Jaycee Lee Dugard was his fifth identified victim. His first documented assault was in Antioch in 1972. He attacked women in South Lake Tahoe in 1976. And then, on the 22nd of November 1976, he approached a 25-year-old casino worker named Katie Calloway Hall at a supermarket in California and asked her for a ride. She accepted. He handcuffed her. He bound her. He drove her nearly 60 miles across the state line to a mini storage warehouse in Reno, Nevada, high on LSD, and he for 8 hours. She was only found when a police officer investigating a broken lock on the storage shed stumbled onto the scene. Garrido was convicted. He was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison for kidnapping and to 5 years to life in a Nevada state court. Katie Calloway Hall later said she was told his projected release date was 2006. She tried to go on with her life, carrying the knowledge that he was locked away and would be for a long time. She was wrong. In 1988, after serving just 11 years of a combined 55-year sentence, a federal parole board released Phillip Garrido. A 5-person panel evaluated him, used a risk assessment table, and decided he was fit to return to the world. He was labeled a sex offender. He was placed on lifetime parole. His parole officer told Katie Calloway Hall not to worry. He said Garrido would be in a fishbowl for the rest of his life. He said he would be monitored daily, drug tested daily, checked at his home regularly, that Garrido would be under a microscope. Less than 3 years after walking out of prison, Phillip Garrido drove to South Lake Tahoe with his wife Nancy and abducted Jaycee Lee Dugard. The parole system did not catch it. The FBI, which later admitted it never had anything close to these people in the Dugard investigation, did not catch it. And after Jaycee disappeared, the investigation in South Lake Tahoe, despite its intensity in those first frantic days, never extended its lens 170 miles southwest to Antioch, where Garrido had already taken her. In those first days, the community mobilized with everything it had. More than 50,000 flyers were distributed within weeks, with another 5,000 printed in Spanish. Hundreds of law enforcement personnel worked the case. Search dogs covered the terrain around the Tahoe Basin. The FBI arrived. America's Most Wanted aired a segment on June 15th, just 5 days after the abduction. Volunteers gathered at the South Lake Tahoe Library every Wednesday to mail posters to gas stations and businesses across the country. In July, the community held Pink Ribbon Day in Jaycee's honor. Her mother, Terry, held a press conference the day after her daughter was taken and pleaded with the kidnappers to bring her home. Carl Probin gave law enforcement the best description he could of the sedan and its occupants. Tips flooded in by the thousands. None of them led to Antioch. Here is what Jaycee Dugard walked into on the 10th of June, 1991. A property at 1554 Walnut Avenue in Antioch, California, owned by Garrido's mother, where Phillip and Nancy lived, and where, over time, they had built something that would not be described in any polite way. In the backyard behind the house, concealed from the street by fencing and overgrown vegetation, was a labyrinth of tents, sheds, and enclosed spaces. 2 sheds, 2 tents, a primitive outhouse, a makeshift shower. One of the sheds was soundproofed. A separate structure had been set up as a recording studio, part of Garrido's ongoing obsession with music and religious messaging. This was not temporary. This was a constructed, deliberate, permanent prison. Jaycee lived in it for 18 years. She was 170 miles from her mother's house. She was 170 miles from the school bus stop on Washoe Boulevard. She was, in almost every sense that mattered, invisible. In the immediate weeks of her captivity, Garrido sexually assaulted her repeatedly. He told her she would never go home. He constructed around her the psychological architecture that abusers build to make escape feel not just impossible, but inconceivable. A mixture of fear and isolation and manipulation, so thorough that over time, It doesn't just control a person's movements, it restructures their understanding of what is normal, what is safe, who can be trusted. Jaycee later wrote that he fed her countless lies, that he terrified her into compliance, that she only left the backyard compound for certain supervised trips, and only after the Garridos had spent years ensuring she would not run, would not call out, would not identify herself to anyone. When she was 14 years old, Jaycee gave birth to her first daughter. There was no hospital, no doctor, no medical assistance of any kind. Nancy Garrido delivered the child in the backyard compound. When Jaycee was 17, she gave birth again, another daughter. Again, no medical care. The two girls grew up in the backyard alongside their mother, knowing no other world, attending no school, receiving no medical attention, existing entirely within the perimeter of Garrido's property. Jaycee later wrote about the birth of her first child with words that are almost impossible to hold. She said she felt like she wasn't alone anymore. That in the arrival of another life, in the middle of everything being done to her, she found something she could love, and who could love her back. It is one of the most heartbreaking sentences ever written about survival. Meanwhile, in the world outside that fence, the investigation had stalled. By the mid-1990s, the active search had wound down to its minimum. Jaycee's family never stopped believing she might be alive. Her mother, Terry Probin, who had held herself together on camera in the days after the abduction with the kind of determination that comes from refusing to accept the worst, eventually remarried and moved to Southern California. She never stopped. But without leads, without any confirmed sighting after the abduction itself, without any reason to look in Antioch, there was nowhere for investigators to go. The case remained open. It went cold. And here is the part that is the hardest to process. Because while the investigation sat frozen, while the case numbers gathered dust, Phillip Garrido was being monitored. He was on lifetime parole. He was a registered sex offender. He wore a GPS ankle bracelet that tracked his movements. He met with parole agents several times per month. Between 1999, when the state of California took over his parole supervision from the federal government, and 2009, when he was finally arrested, parole officers made 60 visits to the property at 1554 Walnut Avenue. 60. They visited the house where Jaycee and her daughters were living in a backyard compound, and they left without finding them. In 2006, a neighbor had reported to police that children were living in tents in the Garrido backyard. Officers came out. They did not search thoroughly enough. They did not find the compound. In 2008, law enforcement visited again. Same result. The secret backyard, as Jaycee would later call it, with quiet devastation in her memoir, was not particularly secret. She wrote, "Funny how I can look back now and notice how the secret backyard didn't really look so secret. It makes me believe no one cared or was even really looking for me. The government failed me for 18 years, and that will take time to heal from." Those sentences deserve to sit, not because they are accusations against individuals, though the systemic failure they describe is real and documented and damning, but because they were written by a person who survived 18 years of captivity and came out the other side with the clarity to name what had happened to her without flinching. There is an extraordinary quality of mind in that, and it is entirely her own. Nobody gave it to her. She built it in a backyard, in the dark, with 2 children and nothing else. Federal parole agents, it emerged after her rescue, had classified Garrido as high risk throughout their supervision of his case. High risk. And despite that classification, they had only visited his house 10 or 11 times over the years they managed his case. When California took over in 1999, the GPS ankle bracelet tracked where he went. But it could not look through a fence. It could not hear what was happening in the compound behind the house. It could tell parole agents that Garrido was home. It could not tell them who else was there. The reports that followed the 2009 arrest were unambiguous. the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office documented 5 major failures in the supervision of Garrido's parole. One of them concerned what had happened in 1988 after he was released, when Katie Calloway Hall, the woman he had raped in that Reno storage warehouse, reported to a parole officer that Garrido had contacted her after his release. She was afraid. She needed someone to act. The parole officer, by all available accounts, shrugged it off. Garrido faced no consequences. 3 years later, he drove to South Lake Tahoe. Katie Calloway Hall learned who had taken Jaycee Dugard the same way most of the country did when the news broke in August 2009. She started screaming. She said, "Oh my God, oh my God. That's who did it. That's who kidnapped me." And then she said something that belongs in this story. He had me for 8 hours. He had her for 18 years. I was an adult with instincts that helped me deal with the situation. She was a child. The discovery, when it finally came not from a law enforcement agency and not from any official monitoring mechanism. It came from 2 campus police officers at the University of California, Berkeley. Their names are Ally Jacobs and Lisa Campbell. On the 24th of August, 2009, Phillip Garrido appeared on the UC Berkeley campus with 2 young girls. He wanted to inquire about holding a religious event on the grounds. Officer Jacobs looked at him. Something was off. She ran his name. The system returned his full record: lifetime parole, rape, kidnapping, registered sex offender. She noted something else. His parole officer had no record of him having children. And yet here were 2 girls standing beside him. Jacobs and Campbell acted on their instincts. They insisted that parole officers investigate further. 2 days later, on the 26th of August, 2009, Phillip Garrido showed up at his parole meeting in Concord, California. He brought Nancy, he brought the 2 girls, and he brought a young woman who introduced herself under a name that wasn't hers. When officers pressed harder, when the structure of Garrido's constructed reality began to buckle under proper scrutiny, he gave it up. He confessed. The young woman, it emerged, was not who she had said she was. She was Jaycee Lee Dugard. She was 29 years old. She had last been seen on a street corner in South Lake Tahoe on the morning of the 10th of June, 1991, when she was 11 years old and wearing a pink jacket. She had been 170 miles away from her family for 18 years in a backyard. The reunion between Jaycee and her mother, Terry Probin, is not something that was filmed or described in clinical detail, because they deserved privacy in that moment more than the world deserved documentation. But Jaycee's aunt, Tina Dugard, spoke to reporters outside the FBI's Los Angeles office and said, "The smile on my sister's face was as wide as the sea. Her oldest daughter is finally home." This is a joyful time for the family. Jaycee remembers all of us. We've laughed, cried, taken pleasure in each other's company. She said Jaycee was getting to know her younger sister, who had been born after the abduction and was only a baby the last time they had been in the same world together. 18 years of a sibling's life, lived in parallel, neither knowing the other. Carl Probin, Jaycee's stepfather, who had ridden his bicycle down that street in 1991 and watched the gray sedan disappear, said he had no idea they would find her alive. After 18 years, most people had quietly accepted that they wouldn't. He was wrong. And the wrongness of that assumption is, in this story, the one piece of light. Phillip Garrido and Nancy Garrido were arrested on the 26th of August, 2009. Phillip was charged with 29 counts, including kidnapping and multiple counts of rape by force. Nancy was charged as an accomplice. Both entered not guilty pleas initially. Then, in a surprise move, they both pleaded guilty, a decision that spared Jaycee and her daughters from having to testify at trial. On the 2nd of June 2011, Phillip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years to life in state prison. Nancy received 36 years to life. Jaycee issued a statement through her attorney. "I'm relieved that Phillip and Nancy Garrido have finally acknowledged their guilt and confessed to their crimes against me and my family. The state of California, which had supervised Garrido's parole and visited his property 60 times without discovering a kidnapped child and her daughters living in a backyard compound, was sued by Jaycee Dugard. The lawsuit was settled for $20 million. It was not enough. No dollar amount is enough for what was taken from her. But it was an acknowledgement, written in the only language institutions understand, that what happened was not just the act of one man. It was the product of a system that classified him as high risk and then failed to act on its own classification, that received reports from neighbors and did not follow through, that accepted GPS data as proof of safety without ever looking behind the fence. Jaycee Dugard wrote a memoir in 2011, published when she was 31 years old, called A Stolen Life. It became a bestseller. In it, she wrote about what was done to her, with a directness that is neither sensationalized nor sanitized, just honest, in the way that people who have survived the unsurvivable sometimes are, because they have moved past the point where pretending serves any purpose. She wrote a second book in 2016 called Freedom, My Book of Firsts, documenting the ordinary experiences she had never had the first time she did certain things on her own, the first times her daughters did things children do. It is a book about the smallest freedoms being enormous, about driving a car and ordering food and walking down a street, and what those things mean when you have not been allowed to do them for most of your life. She established the JAYC Foundation, JAYC standing for Just Ask Yourself to Care, to support families who have survived abduction and captivity. She has spoken publicly about recovery in careful, measured terms, always protective of her daughter's privacy, always clear about the fact that healing is not a destination you arrive at, but a practice you maintain. She said in a 2016 interview, "It's taken a lot of time. It hasn't happened overnight." Her daughters, whose names have never been made public, were 11 and 15 years old when they walked out of Garrido's backyard in 2009. They had lived their entire lives inside that compound. The eldest had been born there. They had never attended school. They had never received medical care. They had never had a childhood in any sense that the word is supposed to mean. Their first experience of the outside world came at an age when most children are already preparing for high school and the next stage of life. Whatever the road to something resembling normal looked like for them, it was longer and harder than almost anything the rest of us will face in our lives. Jaycee has shielded them fiercely, and she should. There are questions in this case that answers alone cannot satisfy. Not because we don't know what happened, we do, in documented, convicted, confessed detail, but because knowing and understanding are different things. We know that a parole board released a man sentenced to 55 years after 11. We know that the warning signs existed before Jaycee was taken and were not acted upon. We know that after she was taken, officers visited the property where she was held, and neighbors reported what they saw, and nothing changed. We know that the system that was supposed to prevent this was functioning, technically, the whole time. It was making visits, it was tracking movement, it was filing reports. And a child was in a backyard for 18 years. What the case of Jaycee Lee Dugard demands of anyone who looks at it honestly is not just anger at Phillip Garrido, though that is entirely appropriate. It demands a reckoning with how institutions assess and manage risk, with what it means to supervise a dangerous person, with a gap between monitoring on paper and actually protecting the community. It demands the kind of scrutiny that is uncomfortable because it implicates not monsters in isolation, but processes and decisions made by ordinary people operating within systems that were inadequate. California conducted its internal review. Federal authorities conducted theirs. Changes to parole supervision protocols were recommended and in some cases implemented. The settlement Jaycee received from the state came with implicit acknowledgement of those failures. But acknowledgements, As the Walsh family knew after Adam, and as Jaycee Dugard knows better than anyone, are not the same as repair. They are not the same as the 18 years she didn't get to live. They are not the same as the childhood her daughters were never given. They are something. They are not enough. What is perhaps most striking about Jaycee Dugard, in the years since she walked out of that compound at 29 years old, is the quality of her survival. Not just the fact of it, though. The fact of it, the sheer improbable reality that she endured 18 years of what was done to her and came out to the other side, capable of writing books and building a foundation and raising 2 daughters and driving a car and ordering food in a restaurant. Not just the fact, but the quality, the clarity she brings to what happened to her, the refusal to be defined exclusively by it, the insistence on protecting her daughters from the world's appetite for their story. The work she does for other survivors. She was a child in a pink jacket walking to a school bus stop. She is a woman who decided, without anyone being able to force it, that the theft of 18 years would not also consume the ones that followed. Phillip Garrido is in a California state prison, serving 431 years to life. Nancy Garrido is also imprisoned, serving 36 years to life. They are both theoretically eligible for parole in 2034. Katie Calloway Hall, the woman Garrido raped in 1976 and whose desperate call to a parole officer in 1988 was ignored, said after his sentencing that something in her had finally closed. That she had lived with his name in her head for 33 years, that it was over. She also said something that has stayed with those who followed this case. The only thing I can think of worse than what happened to me is it happening to my child. I can't imagine what Jaycee is going through. He had me for 8 hours. He had her for 18 years. He had her for 18 years. She was 11 when she walked up a hill in a pink jacket toward a school bus in South Lake Tahoe. She was 29 when she walked out of a parole office in Concord and into a world that had continued without her while she was gone. She missed her teenage years. She missed her 20s. She missed the ordinary accumulation of experience that most of us take for granted: high school and first jobs, and choices about where to live and what to do and who to become. She gave birth in a backyard without a doctor. She raised 2 children in a compound behind a fence. She had her name taken from her and was forced to call herself something else for years. And then she came home. The 2 officers who acted on their instincts at UC Berkeley, Ally Jacobs and Lisa Campbell, are the reason she came home when she did, and not later or never. They saw something. They ran a name. They refused to accept what Garrido told them. They pushed until parole officers investigated. That insistence, that refusal to drop what their instincts were telling them, is the entire hinge on which those 18 years ended, rather than continuing. If you take nothing else from Jaycee's story, take that. The system failed her for 18 years. 2 people doing their jobs with attention and care and a willingness to press rather than accept ended it. The scale of the failure was institutional and vast. The act that undid it was human and immediate. She was 11 years old, with blonde hair and blue eyes, walking up a hill in South Lake Tahoe on a Monday morning in June. Her stepfather watched from a window. Her mother was at home. There was a bus stop at the top of the hill, and a school day ahead of her, and a whole life she was supposed to live. She got it back. Not all of it. You can't return 18 years. You can't untake a childhood. Can't restore what was stolen in that parking lot and in that backyard and in those compounds over all those years. But she got herself back. Her name, her daughters. Her mother, who had spent 18 years not knowing, not giving up, not accepting the silence as an answer. If someone is missing from your life or from your community, don't accept the silence either. If you see something that doesn't sit right, something that doesn't add up, trust that instinct and say something. 2 officers did, and a woman came home.